I'm Brian Russell, and I want to go over with you a survey of the book of Leviticus. This will also give you some framework for actually reading the book of Leviticus on your own and understanding essentially what this sometimes neglected part of the Bible is attempting to do. At its essence, Leviticus is a book about holiness. The end of Exodus, God's people have built the tabernacle, and God's glory comes down and abides with God's people inside of the tabernacle in the Holy of Holies. And so essentially that creates a problem in some way if you want to think about it. And it's this: how does an unholy people live with a holy God in their midst? And so the book of Leviticus is about the sanctification of God's people so that they can live as God's missional people in the world with the holy God in their midst. And essentially, the book breaks into two pieces. And you can debate whether or not it breaks between 17 and 18 or maybe between 16 and 17. But in essence, we can break the book into two pieces. I've gone 1 to 17 and then 18 to 27 in terms of becoming the Lord's holy people and living as the Lord's holy people. And what I want you to see is essentially at the heart of the book is a chiastic relationship here. So with the Day of Atonement at the center of this. And so if you notice, the book opens up with instructions about sacrifices, and then almost at the end here, 23 to 25, it comes back into times in which God's people are to participate in cultic activities, meaning Sabbaths and feasts. Then we have a section, chapters 8 to 10, and some might connect 10 with 11 because it's about the consecration or about Aaron's sons and about how they have forbidden fire. So maybe that's part of clean, unclean, or not, but I've included it with the priests. And then we also have a section in 21 to 22 on priests. Then we have actually a section on clean and unclean. And then we have some practices here. Chapters 18, 19, and 20 talk about certain practices and a way that God's people are supposed to live. And so these are related. And at the center here, we have the Day of Atonement. And what this is, this chiasm supports instrumentation. So at the heart of this book is a instrumentation where the means is sacrifices and practices, with the end being holiness, both becoming holy and remaining holy, right? And so the means to an end, the end is holiness. Again, becoming and abiding in that. Again, this is all of the Lord's work. This is an ongoing practice. So one of the things, the Leviticus doesn't teach that we can make ourselves holy. The sanctifying work is always God's work. Though, what this book does tell us that there's both a means, which again, this whole process of being clean, having priests, having sacrifices to set up the Day of Atonement. So we have sacrifice as the means. So we'll call this whole sacrificial system, if you will. That's the first half of the book. And then we have practices, right? It's the doing of it. It's the living it out. So this would be 18 really through 25, because we're going to talk about the special ending. You could say 27 or in 1 to 17 are the means. So this is kind of the central piece. Now, what do we do with this last section here? Because this is going to serve it as well. 26 and 27, this is actually our climax here. All right, that makes sense. And what's going on, what the drive is, it's a climax with substantiation. So this whole book is driving towards this. And then what happens in these last sections, we have the blessings and curses. Those are, you also see a similar phenomenon in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 27 and 28. But here in Leviticus, we see the blessings of being holy and the consequences for not living as God's holy people. And we also, some of that, the consequences serve in a way to substantiate the demands that God is making. Now, we also have embedded, and this is a lot of the rest of the structures that you find when you study when you study Leviticus, are a lot of recurrences. Let me just name off a few recurrences that become fairly obvious. First of all, there's a broad narrative framework that shapes this entire book. So if you look at the book of Leviticus, this is set within the Sinai materials in the Pentateuch, and it's set within the Tent of Meeting. Again, the Tent of Meeting is set up in Exodus 40, 34 to 38. It's in the sense that it's inaugurated. So it's interesting that immediately at the beginning of Leviticus, God speaks and calls to Moses. So one of the things that happens over and over again, in fact 23 times in Leviticus, is it says the Lord says to Moses. Tent of Meeting, and also there'll be some references to Sinai. So we're going to see that. And again, the rest of the Pentateuch, from Exodus 19 all the way through Numbers 10:10, these are actions that take place at Sinai, and then the book of Deuteronomy builds on that. Okay, so there's a narrative framework here that's set within the entire Pentateuch. There's also a bunch of recurrences. There's intro lines, there's references to historical events. The language of holy versus common, clean versus unclean happens numerous times, almost innumerable times. The priests show up a lot. They're the mediators. They're for sacrificing, instructions, and worship. Language of atonement shows up, drama, and liturgy. So those are just some things that recur. And then also, recurrence that I do want to put up here on the board, there's a recurrence of cause and effect, meaning the reasons, the rationales that are given for obedience. The effect is for people to live out the lives that God's called them to live, to be holy. This is related to the instrumentation, but a little bit different. There's a recurrence of causation. And essentially, the causations are the rationale for obedience. You might say, why should we give ourselves to God? Why should we seek to live out holy lives? In some of the things that Deuteronomy talks about in terms of why we should live holy lives are things like this. It's because Yahweh has saved God's people. Over and over again, you'll have phrases like, I am the Lord. I am holy. The Lord abhors Canaanite practices. Yahweh is to be hallowed. There's a relationship between blood and atonement. So these are some of the reasons here that are given, but the most things are it's essentially roots back in the character of who Yahweh is. So those are some of the structures that we have here. And then let me show you real quick kind of how another principle that sits inside of Leviticus runs. You have this language of essentially two places. You have holy on one side and common on the other. Okay, the process of moving from common to holy is what we would call sanctification. And then you have the opposite when you go back from holy to common, right? Now, another word for common is the old word profane. So that's part of this as well. And then in common, we have two things. We have the states of clean and we have unclean. Now, unclean doesn't necessarily mean bad, but it means that you're not prepared then to go and become holy, because you want to be in the clean state so that you can then be sanctified and then enter into the temple, for example. To be able to be in the presence of God, one has to be in a clean state so that then you can become sanctified and participate in all of the activities. So you want to kind of remember this piece here. So you have to actually be clean so that then you can consecrate yourself, so then you can become sanctified. Anyway, that's a quick video on Leviticus. If you have questions, you can ask me about that in class. I'm Brian Russell. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.